Every Tuesday, before sunrise, Harold Keegan walked the 3 blocks from his apartment to Willowview Diner. It was a routine as steady as the slow tick of the grandfather clock that watched over his living room. Each step measured each breath, patient, each intention, quiet. In his right hand, Harold gripped the polished maple cane his father had carved long ago. He wore the same weathered corduroy jacket, a faded navy blue with the elbows gently patched, and his cap stitched with the insignia of the old Buffalo Air Wing sat perfectly above his silvered hair. 11 years now, longer than the linoleum had been laid, longer than Rose, the young waitress, had poured her first cup of coffee. Harold had sat in the booth by the lake-facing window, alone but never lonely, not in his own mind. Today the world seemed to look right through him. As Harold entered, the bell above the glass door chimed with a thin metallic ring, swallowed by the low murmur of breakfast regulars and the clatter of forks against thick ceramic plates. The air was tinged with the smell of bacon and old coffee, a comforting, slightly burnt scent that always reminded Harold of Sunday mornings after church back when his wife was still alive, and laughter still echoed through their kitchen. Now those memories sat in his mind like pressed flowers, fragile, beautiful, preserved by time and silence. He nodded at Marnie, the hostess, who didn't meet his gaze. Her attention was fixed on her phone thumbs, moving in small, frantic bursts. The local weatherman's voice filtered from the mounted TV high of 17 and Griff today in Kingsford, light winds off Lake Forest. Harold shuffled past his steps, deliberate, his grip firm on the tray he slid from the self-serve counter. 2 eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, no butter, no sugar. Simplicity had served him well ever since the war. He didn't need frills. He needed routine. As Harold started the careful trek to his booth, his hands shook more than usual, the nerves in his fingers rebelling against age and memory. 20 paces he counted quietly, each footstep echoing in his chest. Halfway there, a sharp voice cut through the gentle hum. "Watch your step, Gramps. That coffee's looking heavy." The words came from a table near the wall. 4 men in crisp shirts and city haircuts, visitors, Harold guessed by the way. They sat with their backs too straight and their laughter just a bit too loud for a Tuesday morning. He kept his eyes forward, but the sting settled beneath his skin. He had been called worse in his time. He knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be invisible, to be the object of someone else's punchline. Another voice joined in, louder this time. "Maybe he thinks this is the museum. Careful not to trip over the history, old-timer." The men laughed, a rough sound that scattered across the diner like thrown stones. No one intervened. Not the young couple sharing pancakes 2 booths over. Not the barista restocking stirs. Not even Mr. Farrell, the owner, who peeked out from the kitchen and disappeared just as quickly. Harold focused on the simple act of walking, counting each step. By the time he reached his booth, his pride felt scraped raw, but his expression did not betray it. With practiced care, he placed the tray down, lining everything up just so: the plate, the mug, the knife and fork. His reflection in the window stared back, a face lined by years' eyes that had seen sunrises in too many countries, a mouth pressed into a thin line of quiet resolve. He had just begun to cut his toast when it happened. A tremor in his hand, a slight nudge of the tray, and the mug of coffee tipped dark liquid rolling across the table and over the edge with a sharp splash. It pooled on the linoleum, shining in the pale morning light. For a heartbeat, the whole diner seemed to freeze. Then came the snickers. "Should have brought a sippy cup," one of the men barked, setting off another round of laughter. Harold's ears burned. He reached for napkins, moving slowly, his joints stiff with pain and humiliation. He knelt, awkward, aching, blotting the spill with steady hands. No one offered help. Silence reigned thick as syrup, save for the laughter behind him. The pain in his back flared, but he kept his movements gentle, refusing to show just how much it cost him. Humiliation burned slow. Harold felt the weight of each gaze turned away from him, the absence of kindness almost louder than the taunts themselves. It wasn't just the ridicule, it was the knowledge that everyone else found it easier to be silent than to offer aid. He remembered the battlefield, not the noise, but the aftermath, the way pain lingers when left unspoken. That's when Rose appeared, gliding over from behind the counter, her step sure and her eyes worried. She knelt beside Harold, her voice low. "Let me help, Mr. Keegan." She scooped up the fork he had dropped, slid a clean one onto his table, and set to wiping up the coffee. For a brief moment, the room's chill softened. Rose didn't meet the eyes of the men behind Harold, but her jaw was tight, her shoulders squared. "Thank you, Rose." Harold murmured the words, almost lost in the hush. As she rose and carried the stained napkins away, Harold settled back into the booth, moving slowly, pain radiating from his knees. He pressed his palm flat against the table solid, real, the only thing anchoring him in the moment. Behind him, the laughter dulled, but did not vanish. Something inside the room had shifted, not broken, but cracked like ice thawing at the lake's edge in spring. Harold looked again at his reflection, at the worn grooves in the wood at the empty seat across from him. The booth was his symbol, his monument, his refuge, his quiet claim to dignity in a world content to look away. As he stared out at the shimmer of morning light on Willow Lake, he wondered if anyone would ever remember why he kept coming back, or if the world would simply let him disappear one Tuesday at a time. As the clock behind the counter ticked on and the day crept forward, Harold understood one truth as clearly as he had the day his cane was first carved. You can't make people see you. You can only stand your ground quiet and unwavering until someone finally does. As the lake breeze rustled the glass, Harold took a long, steady breath, ready to face whatever silence or scorn the next Tuesday would bring. Last Tuesday still hung heavy in Harold Keegan's memory as the morning light broke gently over Willowview. It was a different sort of dawn, a little sharper, a little colder, as if the air itself carried the echo of spilled coffee and laughter, not yet forgiven. The news of his embarrassment and the pointed ridicule that followed had not faded with the rising sun. If anything, it had spread first in whispers inside the diner, and then more cruelly across the town's social circles and screens. Someone, maybe one of the city men or a curious onlooker, had filmed Harold's trembling hands, the dark stains seeping across the table, and the mocking jeers that followed. By Wednesday morning, the clip had already begun making the rounds on social media shared in neighborhood groups and beyond. A snappy hashtag trailed behind Tuesday, spill the sort of thing folks laughed about over lunch, a meme for those eager to fill silences with someone else's pain. Even as he sat by his window watching a pair of ducks glide along the lake's pale surface, Harold's phone buzzed with notifications he'd never open. The booth by the window had always been his place of comfort, sturdy, fixed as constant as the sunrise over Lake Forest. Now when he imagined returning, Harold felt something new, a tremor beneath the old resolve. The thought of eyes watching, of whispered jokes and sideways glances pressed in on him like the memory of jungle heat on his skin all those years ago. He wondered if his presence might only feed the town's appetite for a little harmless fun, a moment's distraction at his expense. Still Tuesday came again. Habit outweighed pride, and so with the cane steady in his grip and his jacket zipped tight against the wind, Harold made his way to Willowview. The bell's chime sounded no different than before, but the hush that followed as he entered was a different kind of silence. Heavy, expectant, almost clinical. Heads turn. Heads. Conversations paused just long enough to let their eyes sweep over him before resuming a little louder than necessary. As Harold approached the self-serve counter, he caught a reflection of himself in the chrome jacket, a little more rumpled face, more tired. There was no anger in him, not really, just a deep fatigue that ached through his bones. He set his tray, hands shaking more than usual, and heard the scrape of a chair, a deliberate, drawn-out sound that made his skin prickle. The group from last week was absent, but their memory remained stitched into the corners of every smile and sideways look. At his booth, Harold arranged his meal eggs, toast black coffee by rote. The surface was spotless now. Someone had scrubbed away the stain. Yet in his mind, the ghost of last week's spill still shimmered on the laminate, a dark shadow only he could see. He sipped his coffee, slowly, eyes focused on the quiet movement outside, trying to make himself small, trying to fade into the pale morning light. It was impossible to ignore the weight of observation. Near the counter, a teenager scrolled on her phone, snickering at something on the screen. Perhaps the video, perhaps the comments. The sound of laughter, even quiet, made Harold's chest tighten. He didn't look up. Instead, he focused on the familiar routine. A pinch of salt, a cut of toast, a sip of coffee. Every movement deliberate, contained private. He counted each step, each breath, each swallow, like a man walking an invisible tightrope above a crowd waiting for him to stumble. Rose, the waitress, approached with her usual careful pace. She offered a gentle "Morning, Mr. Keegan," Her voice hushed, her eyes soft with concern. She set a fresh carafe of coffee on the table, an unspoken promise to refill his cup without being asked. But even she seemed more cautious today, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one saw her linger too long. Harold nodded his thanks, a faint smile flickering and then vanishing. He wanted to say something reassuring to tell her he was fine, but the words caught behind his teeth. He knew Rose had seen the video. Everyone had, and though her kindness still shone through, it felt brittle, almost apologetic, as if she too had been swept up by the current and was struggling to stay afloat. The booth had always been more than just a seat. It was his marker proof of his persistence, a little monument to the endurance that had carried him through deserts and jungles, and now through the slow and different grind of age. Now it felt different. Where once it had been a shield against the world, now it seemed a stage, and he unwillingly the main act in someone else's comedy. The symbol he clung to for dignity now brought its own quiet brand of pain. Outside, beyond the smudged glass, families strolled past the diner, a boy and his father tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks. Life went on, untroubled and different. Inside, the low whir of the ceiling fan filled the pauses between conversations, and somewhere in the kitchen a timer beeped sharp and insistent. Harold sat small and silent, determined not to yield, not to let the memory of laughter push him from the place he'd made his own. Even so, he felt the isolation more deeply than ever before. No longer just the natural quiet of a man who'd learned to live with his memories, but a pointed loneliness shaped by public spectacle. He wondered briefly if he should give up the booth, let someone else take his place by the window. Let the town forget the Tuesday spill ever happened. But habit and something stubborn in his bones kept him rooted. As he finished his meal, Harold caught Rose's eye across the room. She offered a small, uncertain wave, as if to remind him that not everyone had forgotten how to care. He nodded back, a gesture, both of gratitude and of reassurance, even if neither felt quite complete. When he rose to leave, the bell above the door rang again, bright and insistent. For a moment the hush deepened, every head in the diner following his slow steps toward the exit. Harold lifted his cane, walked out into the crisp morning, and did not look back. As the door swung closed behind him, Harold knew that next Tuesday would come just as surely as this one had, and he would be there at his booth by the lake, whether the world welcomed him or not. Last Tuesday's shadow still lingered as Harold Keegan prepared for another morning at Willowview Diner. This time, though, his steps felt heavier, a careful, almost reluctant procession along Maple Avenue, past the oak trees and the lake already waking in the blue dawn. He walked slower, letting the cane bear more of his weight, feeling the ache not only in his joints but in the invisible places too, the hollow carved by public shame, the echo of laughter that refused to fade. His old corduroy jacket seemed thinner than usual in the breeze, and for a brief moment Harold considered turning back. But habit, quiet, unbreakable, carried him forward just as it always had. Inside, the diner buzzed with a subdued energy. The usual morning crowd was joined by a handful of unfamiliar faces, their glances flickering between their phones and the booth by the window. Harold took his place, adjusting the silverware, steadying his breath. He could feel the hush tightening as he sat. Even the ceiling fan seemed to whir more softly, the sun inching its way across the laminate toward his table. His booth, his symbol, his post waited for him like an old friend. He barely touched his coffee, fingers tracing the edge of the mug, instead eyes fixed on the movement outside, fishermen casting lines from the dock, a mother jogging past with a stroller. For all that seemed the same, the air inside was different, expectant, coiled attention, not entirely his own. Whispers passed from table to table. Someone somewhere giggled and stopped abruptly. This time the city men were back, three of them, Brent the ringleader and two others lounging at a table not far from the counter. Their eyes darted toward Harold, then away again, as if uncertain of their part in the morning's script. Harold tried to make himself smaller, tucking in his shoulders, keeping his gaze low. He didn't want to be the center of another show. Yet as he began his breakfast, a voice, a different one, deep and deliberate, rose up from across the room. Sergeant Keegan. It was not a question, not a shout, but a statement, a name spoken with weight and intent. Heads turned, conversation stopped mid-sentence. And all at once, every eye in Willowview settled on the tall, broad-shouldered man by the far window. He stood straight-backed, military stillness in every line. His jacket was plain, but the crisp white collar and the gleam of his shoes spoke of discipline. He walked the long path across the tiled floor, each step measured unhurried. When he reached Harold's booth, he paused not beside but directly behind, as if standing guard. For a heartbeat, Harold could only stare at the reflection in the window, the stranger, his own pale face, the dawn-colored lake behind them both. The room waited. The silence felt sacred, tender, almost trembling. Then with practiced care, the man reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a worn laminated photograph. He lifted it so the room could see two young men caked in mud and sweat, one carrying the other through tangled brush, faces sharp with pain, eyes fixed on a distant horizon. This man, the stranger said quietly, carried me out of a burning barracks at Fort Adams. 2 miles through smoke and flames, bullet in his leg. He never let go. The words, so simple, landed with the force of thunder. He never spoke of it, not once. But everything I have, my family, my life, started with what he did that day. A collective breath held the diner in its grip. Even Brent and his companions, once so loud, sat frozen, their bravado stripped away. Rose, the waitress, paused mid-step, her hand clutching a pot of coffee to her chest. In that moment, Harold was not a meme, not a punchline. He was the reason a man stood alive before them. The stranger turned to the counter, his voice steady but strong. I'll be covering Mr. Keegan's breakfast today, and every Tuesday from here on if he'll let me. His gaze swept the room. Some debts never get repaid, but respect is the least we can offer. It was then that Mr. Farrell, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from his hands. He looked at Harold, then at the stranger, and back again. Mr. Keegan, he said, voice softer than Harold had ever heard, we'd like to dedicate this booth to you. With your permission, of course. You've sat here longer than most of us have been around. Maybe it's time folks remember why. Harold, overwhelmed, could barely manage a nod. The applause that followed was quiet but true, a few hands clapping, a couple of voices murmuring assent, a gentle wave of recognition rolling across the little diner. Brent stood looking smaller somehow. He approached Harold, holding his cap in his hands, voice low. Sir, what we did, we were wrong. My father served too. I forgot what it means to stand for something. The apology was clumsy, unfinished, but sincere. Harold met his gaze for a moment, offered a single nod, and that was enough. The photograph, still resting on the table, gleamed in the morning light. Rose placed a small vase of wildflowers beside it, her eyes glistening as she whispered, it's about time. All at once, the mood in Willowview shifted. The tension, the scorn, the wary glances melted away, replaced by something softer, weightier, and more lasting. For the first time in years, Harold felt not just seen, but understood. As he sat in his booth now, his truly, Harold knew that while he had never asked for honor, there was power in letting the truth be witnessed at last. And as laughter, now warm and easy, returned to the diner, Harold looked to the window where the sun finally crowned the lake and allowed himself the smallest, most genuine smile. The next Tuesday would not come quietly, but it would come with something new, the promise of respect earned, and the beginnings of belonging long overdue. A week had passed since the day the silence in Willowview Diner turned into something like reverence. Morning broke with a hush of mist over Lake Forest, the sun glinting off water and dappling the storefronts along Maple Avenue. Harold Keegan moved a little easier this Tuesday, his steps measured, but sure as he made his way through the sleepy town he had called home for decades. In his hand, the old cane tapped a steady rhythm, its maple wood worn smooth by time and habit. He paused outside the diner's wide front window, peering through glass that now bore a fresh brass plaque reserved for Sergeant Harold Keegan, still standing. The letters shone with new polish, catching the light in a way that felt both proud and quietly humble. Below the plaque, inside a small frame, was the faded photograph, two men battered, and young one carrying the other through mud and fire. Someone, likely Rose or Mr. Farrell, had placed a sprig of wild violets there, a silent tribute as delicate as the memory itself. Inside, the familiar morning symphony unfolded, the clatter of cups, the sizzle of eggs, the low comfort of country music humming beneath conversation. As Harold entered, the bell's chime was softer, almost musical. Heads lifted, nods, and gentle smiles greeting him in a way that felt entirely different from weeks past. He moved to his booth, his hands steady as he set his cap on the windowsill and slid onto the cushion. For the first time in years, he did not feel invisible. Instead, he felt anchored, woven into the fabric of the place, like one of the old maple trees out front. Brent and his friends, once so quick to laugh and jeer, sat together at a nearby table. When Brent caught Harold's eye, he stood up and approached his ball cap, clutched nervously. "Morning, Sergeant Keegan," he said, voice steady but softer than before. "Would you mind if we join you today?" The question hung in the air for a beat. Harold gestured to the open seats across from him. Brent's friends followed quieter, respectful the rowdiness of their first encounter, gone replaced by something closer to humility. As the men sat, Rose arrived with a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of wheat toast. No butter, just as Harold liked it. "How's the leg today?" she asked gently, her tone familiar and warm. "Good enough," Harold replied with a small smile. "Better for the company." She poured the coffee, lingered for a moment, then moved on her presence, leaving behind a trace of kindness. Conversation at the table was slow, at first punctuated by pauses and careful words. Brent spoke about his father, who had served in Desert Storm, and rarely spoke of it much the same way. Harold kept his own stories folded deep inside. The others listened sometimes, asking questions, sometimes only nodding, but always with genuine interest. Before long, laughter, this time easy and unforced, bubbled up between sips of coffee and stories about old cars, fishing trips, and the town's changing seasons. As the morning unfolded, Clarence, the broad-shouldered veteran whose quiet act of respect had transformed the diner, arrived, still carrying himself with military grace. He took his seat beside Harold without a word, offering only a nod and a companionable smile. Together, their presence gave the booth an air of quiet dignity, drawing others near. A young man in a navy hoodie stopped by, introducing himself as the grandson of a Korean war vet. He shook Harold's hand, his eyes bright with respect. Even Marnie, the hostess, who once barely noticed Harold, brought him a slice of apple pie on the house, her gesture small but meaningful. Soon word of the dedication spread beyond Willowview. Other veterans began to gather at the diner on Tuesdays, sharing stories and memories, sometimes just silent companionship. Mr. Farrell announced a heritage breakfast once a month, free for all local veterans and their families, with a portion of proceeds supporting a new scholarship in Harold's name for students interested in public service. The booth by the lake-facing window, once merely a refuge for one man's solitude, became something more, a place where memories were honored, where young and old could sit together and learn from each other. The photograph remained the brass plaque, gleaming in every kind of light, the violets always fresh. The town, which once watched in silence or looked away, now paused, remembered, and participated. Respect became contagious, a quiet legacy spreading from one Tuesday to the next. For Harold, the world no longer felt like a stage where he stumbled alone. The symbol he had clung to, his booth, had changed, growing from a shelter to a touchstone, a visible reminder that dignity survives not in grand gestures, but in steadfast presence and the willingness to listen, to endure, and to forgive. On a morning heavy with sunlight and promise, as he sat with his new companions, Harold lifted his coffee cup and gazed out at the blue sweep of Lake Forest. The plaque above his booth caught the sun and sent a golden flash across the table. He smiled, feeling not only seen, but needed, part of something that would last long after he was gone. And so Tuesday by Tuesday, the legacy of Sergeant Harold Keegan and the quiet honor of one simple booth carried on, sturdy and shining into the days ahead.